Hi, everybody. It's JT from the CC and JT Amateur Hour. Production values go to die, obviously. Somewhere over there is CC. Say hi, CC.
Hello.
And we are honored today to be joined by Dr. Deborah Derrickson Kossmann, who wrote such an excellent book called Lost, Found, Kept. And we're here to talk about that book. We're here to talk about your memoir. And before we dive too deeply, Dr. Kossmann, do you prefer Deb or Dr. Kossmann?
You can call me Deb.
Okay, we'll call you Deb. Good, that'll save some seconds on this podcast. So, Deb, why don't you do the honor of introducing yourself, and why don't you sell us your book?
Lost, Found, Kept is a memoir about my complicated mother and my complicated childhood. And it tells the story about going into my mother's hoarding house after 30 years of not being in it. And that's kind of the narrative through line for the book. And then coming off of that is what we discovered and history about my growing up and about my complicated family and how we got to this point that we got to.
And I did read your book this week, and you figuratively, metaphorically bear all. So much respect for that. So the question I have is when people have read the book, like I've read the book, and they've come to you and said, boy, you are not alone. Does that give you some sort of validation, or is that the reason you wrote the book?
I think that's part of the reason I wrote the book. There's so much shame and misunderstanding about hoarding and about families where this is an issue, and the numbers are astounding. I mean, it just became an official diagnosis in 2013, and literally 1 in 40 Americans have the diagnosis. They meet the criteria for the diagnosis. So we're talking about a lot of people. So part of what I wanted to do in the book was to be as real as possible and really tell the story about how this happens. So a lot of people have come to me about stories about their families and relatives. Pretty much every time I read it, somebody shows up and talks about that, which kind of fits with the numbers. But also, I think it also opens up things for other people about other experiences they've had growing up. So I've heard from a lot of different people about, this piece of the book really made me think more deeply about how my family functions, or this piece made me think about my own mom.
So the book cover is over your shoulder there, Lost, Found, Kept. And the book is also divided, Lost, Found, Kept. So my impression from reading, and you please correct me as I'm wrong, is the lost part was not only the lost part with your mother, but the lost part in your life where you seem to be sort of feeling around, evolving as an adult. And then through your team of counselors and significant others, you kind of found yourself. But you also found, you were struggling to find that middle ground between you and your mother. And then the kept is where you basically did finally, come to the metaphorical end of your journey. Would that be a correct interpretation?
Yeah, I think that fits very well. I mean, the original title of the book was What We Hold On To. And grammatically, it didn't quite work for the publisher, so we had to rethink the title. But we used the epigraphs at the beginning of the book to kind of play around with it a little bit. But in the end, I wanted something very clean and simple. So I think the lost part is also all the things that left in my family and for my mother at the beginning parts of the book. And also, the keeping part is about, kind of having the compassion for myself and for my mother and my family in going through all this. I think a lot of memoirs, in a lot of memoirs, that's a difficult struggle to get that balance right.
So fictional writers, not memoir, but fictional writers are very famous for putting themselves in the book. And Stephen King is famous for that. He will sometimes stick a reporter or a teacher in the book that is Stephen King. And when I do that, I find myself acting like the beginning of Romancing the Stone, where the writer there, Joan Wilder, is crying over her books, blowing her nose with a Post-its and things like that. I can only imagine the struggle, the technical side of you writing this book. Where did the strength come from? And were you the Joan Wilder where you were just, your partner Mark was just emptying garbage bags of tissues as you were writing this book?
Well, the question is always about memoir was it cathartic to write? And I don't believe the best memoirs come from that. So my crying had kind of already been done. Although I will say it was funny the other day, I was reading at a bookstore and I read one section of the book and I found myself tearing up a little as I was reading it, which is interesting. That doesn't happen all the time, but it does happen sometimes. I think that, here's the thing about memoir is that, in order to write it well, you have to have kind of gone through the processing of it psychologically. So for example, the most vivid stuff around the hoarding and going into the hoarding house and what we discovered, every day when I came home from that clean out, the crisis that we were in, I would journal. I would just dump literally everything that I had seen and heard and felt and just dumped it in my journal because I knew I wasn't going to remember it well. And so later on, I had that material to go back to when I was writing those scenes because I think, it's really hard to access stuff later. Memory changes things. So the vividness of some of those scenes came from my journaling and sort of trying to be present with it.
So, and that's, I think, often seeing it on paper versus internalizing it is not only a kind of cleansing, but also a kind of reality check.
Well, it was really important to me to have a record of what had happened. I mean, we did some videotaping. I mentioned in the book, a friend of mine who works for a national news organization came in. There's a scene in the book where she comes in and takes some pictures at my request because I knew I wasn't going to remember it well. I knew I wasn't going to be able to hold on to all of it and really be able, I wasn't sure what I was going to do with it, let me just say. The book had an earlier form in 2014 where I left my mother out. I had vowed that I wasn't going to write about my mother until she was gone. I had written a memoir about kind of growing up and being a psychologist and a writer and some of my experiences. And I shopped it around and everybody kept saying to me, something's missing. But I couldn't write about my mother because I didn't really know the whole story. So then in 2016, when the house happened, after it was done, and that was in September, in December, I said to someone, I'm like, this is the story. The clean out and the hoarding house is the story, and it's my story now. I can tell it. I want to be able to tell it, which really is about telling all the family secrets too.
So I do, and it's just very well written from A to Z. And I'm sorry, Cece, you look like you wanted to ask a question.
I was just trying to refresh my memory. I believe this is your only book so far, that you've written mostly articles up to this point. So
Yeah,
I was curious if, is this something you always intended to write a book? You did mention that you were shopping the idea around a little bit. So were you getting to the point where you just wanted to write a book? And especially since it is a memoir, is it, so it was planned or versus it just kind of came about due to the situation?
It's interesting as a writer, right? I've kept journals seriously since I was 17. So I've always been a nonfiction writer. I mean, I've written features and essays. I really love the essay format, probably because I started out as a poet. And I think essays are sort of poetry, but long form. And so I never thought that I could write a book. I always thought I was going to sort of do these other forms. And then something shifted for me as I got a little bit older, and I really found myself thinking about, I was reading more memoirs. I read a huge amount of fiction and poetry. I actually find fiction the most helpful for my writing in some ways. But I think, having the hook for the story, one of the issues with memoirs is that they get soggy in the middle and that the memoirist often doesn't know where to end it. So the two things that I didn't want to happen in my book, I wanted it to have a strong narrative arc where you JT, you talk about being pulled in, and reading it. But I think, kind of having it be, defined in a way. And the hoarding stuff kind of suddenly answered that question about how to do that, because I'd really struggled with the structure of the memoir.
So in a sense, when you were writing it, did you feel like maybe you were hoarding some of the things that you wanted to include in it?
Oh, totally. I wrote an essay recently that was published by Psyche about how the writing process is like hoarding. And it was just published. And I think as an inveterate journal keeper forever, I think yes, definitely. I mean, in my family, keeping things is about relationship. You can keep experiences, you can keep people, you can keep things, but that I don't think it's a coincidence that I wrote a memoir.
Well, it's technically speaking, structurally speaking, it's very well put together. So not only kudos to yourself, but kudos to your creative team. They should be patting themselves on the back. So let's go back to the hoarding, and we don't want to make this into a counseling session, but I think this is a value opportunity for you as a professional to give some quick advice. What advice do you have for family members who do discover they have a hoarder in the family?
Well, like I said, I mean, it's a much bigger diagnosis than most people realize. And there's different levels of hoarding. It ranges from kind of minimal clutter all the way up to level 5, which would be my mother. We call it, fondly at my house, we call it DEFCON 5, And so for family members struggling with this, it's complicated. The problem is it's kind of like 2.5% in the regular population and like 6% in older people when you look at that 1 in 40 number. So what it means is as people age, sometimes cognitively they struggle more, physically they struggle more, and so a lot of adult children are left dealing with these hoarding situations. So it's pretty common. I mean, I've been doing a bunch of interviews with different people about, housing cleanouts and how to manage relatives and what do you suggest. The diagnosis itself is incredibly complicated. Hoarding disorder is a diagnosis itself, but it also, a lot of people who have it have depression. They have sometimes thought disorder stuff. My mother had a lot of paranoia. Sometimes they have ADD. Sometimes there's almost always the trigger of grief or loss that happens before the hoarding really takes off. So there's some association to trauma and to grief as well. So it's a very complicated diagnosis. So I say to people, get lots of support for yourself if you're dealing with this kind of situation in terms of, a good psychologist, people that you can talk to and get support. There's a number of support groups online. I'll give you some numbers. The Reddit hoarding group has 60,000 people on it. The children of hoarding groups on Reddit have a combined total of like roughly 28,000 people in them. So, I mean, it's a lot of people that struggle with this. One of the things is it's not about somebody being lazy. It's not about somebody people are very attached to their possessions. And also sometimes the best plan of action is to make things habitable. So, stopping the mail to somebody's house, helping them with hygiene issues, making sure there's water in the house, making sure those kinds of things, and because the reality is, like my mother, I mean, people are autonomous. My mother functioned at a very high level for a very long time, even with living in the chaos that was that house. And the question is, when do you intervene with someone's mental illness if they're functioning? And until she wasn't functioning well, we really didn't intervene because she was able to make her own choices, even if we didn't agree with them and even if they were bad choices.
And it should be noted, complicating the issue, of course, is your mother was a medical professional herself, so she could speak the language, she could speak the lingo. So I would assume, and I don't know this because I didn't remember this from the book, if she was approached by folks, she could say, hey, well, this is just a XYZ phase of my life, and use the right medical language to express that.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, we had a number of conversations, about, hey, Mom, like, it's time, you want to downsize. I've heard you talk about it. Like, let's come in and we'll help you downsize. We'll help you do stuff, And, she was having none of it. I mean, she wanted to maintain her independence and her autonomy, and people really dig in with this. It is a very, very difficult. There's a thing called clutter blindness where it's almost dissociative, where the person doesn't even see the chaos that they're living in. So I think that's really, that's one of the things that happens with it too.
Well, much respect for you, much respect on your journey, much respect on attacking, DEFCON 5. So, so we're going to go ahead and slide into Act 2 here, and Cece, take it away.
Okay, so Act 2 is based on James Lipton's end of the Inside the Actors Studio episodes. We've taken some of those questions and tweaked them a little bit for writers. So we did provide these in advance so that we're not blindsiding you, hopefully. But based on your experiences, and this may be a little different from some fiction writers, but what was your first real, honest, I am a real writer moment?
I kind of have two of those. I actually talk about both of them in the book. One was when I was around 9, and I remember saying to myself I wanted to write a short story like the short stories that were in, Red Book magazine. And I remember sitting down at my desk and like writing the first 2 paragraphs, and I'm like, that's hard. And then going outside and playing. The other one, I don't know if I write specifically about that in the book, but the other one was when I was in college, and I did a winterim with a professor who was kind of the creative writing professor at my school, and I loved it so much. I was like, this is what I wanted to do. I didn't know quite how I was going to do that at the time, but at the time I was, doing more poetry. So that was, I was doing poetry and I was doing feature articles for the school newspaper and stuff because I really liked doing those kinds of things too.
Well, it's fascinating that you had one so young at 9 because I think so many of us don't really have those until we're well into adulthood.
Well, I was a huge reader, and when you're a huge reader and you love books the way I loved books, like that's what you want. Like that,
right.
You want to do that magic too, whatever that is.
That's very cool. So, who is your writing role model and why?
You guys sent me this question, and I really struggled with this because I feel like I have so many writing teachers from the books that I've read, favorite writers and people that I, admire, and also people that I've heard speak about their own writing process and have learned from that, different things. I think probably, Dr. Wertheim in college is the biggest mentor because one of the things that he taught me was patience. And we were talking about how this book is my first book, and I just turned 65. I won the Aurora Polaris Creative Nonfiction Prize in 2023 for this book, and publishing when you're an older person, it's like you can still call yourself a writer even if you don't have a book. And I think that was kind of his motto. And his motto was like, you just keep writing. Like nobody's asking you to do this. You keep writing, you keep doing what you do. And eventually, hopefully it goes your way.
I do think that's a very valid point that a lot of us maybe who are early in our publishing journey and haven't yet actually published anything don't really feel like real writers until it's out there in the world. But the fact that you're actually writing, actively writing, is that's enough. If that's all you ever do.
Yeah, that's what makes you a writer. I mean, you don't do it for the other stuff. If I was never published, would I keep writing? I would keep writing, even if it was just in my journals. And I say just in my journals, but I'm up to 71 journals. And I've gone back and I've read through them at different times. It's a very interesting process. They, of course, never contain, just as a writing piece of advice, they never contain the thing that you actually want to be writing about or that you think was important looking back on it. They have like extraneous stuff in it. You're like, why was I writing about this?
Right. Especially when you're younger, I think. I know I have off and on journaled over the years, and sometimes I look back and it's like, wow, I was a drama queen.
You were practicing dramatic arcs.
Yes. She was a drama queen.
Stop airing my dirty laundry. So we've kind of touched on this already, but what do you love about writing?
It's funny because my husband's like, I don't understand. You whine about this all the time, like how hard it is. I love that it's hard, actually. And I love that it helps me make sense of my experiences. I think that's how I started as a writer, is that if I was listening to me, then the things that happened to me really happened. And I think there's something about being able to hear yourself and to make something of your experiences that for me is incredibly powerful and that I really love. So, even in my journals, like if that was all I was writing, like that would be enough in some ways,
So basically just doing it is really...
Yeah. It's the doing it when it's fun to do it. And let me just say, like, the doing it on a deadline is like, a whole different thing. Or there were I've done some, writing, I do some writing residencies. I'm going off to Virginia for the Center for the Creative Arts later this year. And, you have like all this time to like sit and write. So you really, I understand my own writing process really well, but I think it freaks a lot of people out to go to a residency because they don't really know what their own process is. So then they're like, wait, am I supposed to be writing, 24/7? Like, my first residency, there's a funny story, is my first residency that I ever did, I went and it was at Ragdale Foundation, and they used to keep little journals in the room where writers would like write notes to other writers that were going to have the room later. And my room had been, the person before me was a thriller writer who used to come to Ragdale to edit his books. So all he wrote in this book was his word count for the day. So it was like 50,000 words, 20,000 words, 30,000 words, like for each day. And I'm like reading this thing and I'm like, is this what I'm supposed to do at a residency? Like, oh my God, like how, I can't do this. So
That's
it was
wild.
very funny. Yeah.
Oh
But
my
I think,
God.
yeah.
Well, that actually kind of leads nicely into the next question. So what do you absolutely dread about writing?
Well, I think it's hard when you struggle with some of the structural problems. One of the hardest chapters in this book for me to write, there were two difficult things about this book, and I really appreciated, JT, what you said about the form of the book, because getting the right structure and how to structure the material was incredibly difficult. I mean, I had all kinds of arcs and, just really trying to make it tight. And I think what's hard about memoir and what's hard about writing is what's important to me as a person is not necessarily what helps you tell a good story, right? Andrew Wyeth, the painter, has a great line about, it's what you leave out of a painting that leaves the residue. And I think with writing, it's the same. It's like, just because it means something to me doesn't mean it has to be in the book. And I think with memoir, sometimes memoirists get confused about that and struggle with that in terms of, well, does it move the story or is it just something that I feel is like important? So I think making those kinds of decisions is really hard. Like you have to cut, what's the line about, burning your babies or killing your infants or killing your darlings. Thank you. That's a terrible thing, not killing your infants. But you know what I mean? Like,
Right.
it feels like killing your infants. So I
hard.
think that sometimes playing with the structure is really hard. One of the hardest chapters for me to write in this book actually was the chapter about my biological father, because it's a different book, really. The father story in my book had to be in there because of my mother, but it's really different material. And to tell that story about how I found him again after, I don't think I'm giving anything away, finding my stepfather, like how to do that chapter in a way that was really a struggle. It took me like 2 months to figure out the form for that chapter. It was really, really difficult.
And I have to say, having read your book, I was caught up in your journey. I was caught up in your journey with your mother. And then when you did drop your father and your stepfather into the book, it didn't, and I don't mean this as a negative criticism, it didn't seem to flow as well as the rest of the book. So I could see why you're saying that it was challenged. And again, I don't mean that as a criticism, more of an observation. Take that for what you wish.
Yeah, well, I think it's hard because, right, this goes back to this idea of like what's most relevant to the story. Like, if it is relevant about part of the losing things was my mother losing the fathers, losing the husbands, me losing the fathers, those kinds of things. But I think, it's hard because it's like you have to give enough detail. How do you decide to give enough detail to tell the story, but also without getting lost in a whole nother book?
Yeah. And I think you balanced it well. I do think you balanced it well, but it was, get back to mom. But
she does have the main character energy. I don't know what to say.
And again, that's not meant as a negative criticism. And, and I'm going to sort of steal Cece's thunder here by, since you wrote a memoir, your entire book is a single significant event that shapes your writing, good or bad. So do you want to add to that, or shall we move to the next? The question is, what single significant life experience affects your writing, good or bad? Well, your entire book is that experience.
Well, I think the hoarding house was definitely it, if I had to pick something. I'll say something interesting about that wasn't clear to me until I was sort of out of the weeds with it, and I've thought about it a lot since the book was published, because there's the initial trepidation when you publish a memoir about feeling exposed and about how people are going to receive it and stuff. I think one of the interesting things about having the hoarding house happen was that from a very young age, as you know from the book, I was aware of my mother's uniqueness and some of her issues. And I think, my mother functioned at a very high level. If you met her, you would have loved her. She was porous and creative and interesting and wanted to learn lots of things. All of that was true. But also that experiencing that house and then witnessing it and writing about it was also validation in a way for my experiences of being aware of who she was and what was really happening in my family. So there was a kind of validation for myself in doing that. But everybody saw then what was happening, and so I think there's something powerful about that.
You're right. That is, I imagine that to be a very raw experience to write something and put it out there in the world, because even as fiction writers, I think we feel this way because, and I'm sure JT will agree with me on this, is that since we put so much of ourselves into our characters sometimes, it does feel a little bit like, hey, here I am, look at me. And I can only imagine that's got to be so much more magnified maybe when you're doing something that's so much more personal.
Yeah, well, I think the way that I think about it, and I think most nonfiction writers would probably say the same, is that in the book, all of the same things are true that are true for fiction in terms of making a character, right? The difference is I have to stick to the facts. You get to play around and, kind of make things a little different, and I have to stick, pretty close to, it's creative nonfiction, so there might be a little bit of, shifting around of things, but I think, kind of, it's not the whole picture, right? So I think there's the element of being exposed. It's interesting, many years ago I wrote an article about going through infertility treatment, and to this day I occasionally get emails from people who are like, I'm so sorry you went through this. It was 25 years ago now, it was a long time ago. But I think that immediacy of reading about a character and how you relate to it, it happens in fiction, it happens in nonfiction, but it helped me to think about it as this is the me in the book. It's not all of me. It doesn't say all of me. It's not all of Mark. It doesn't say everything about my sister or everybody in the book.
And I think you also touched a little bit on the next question, so I'm going to tweak it. The question generically is, would you recommend the writing life to a loved one? But I think you mentioned, since you like journaling and everything, and you think maybe that's kind of a cathartic process, that would you recommend writing for publication to a loved one versus just writing for yourself?
Yeah, I think, I read that question and I was like, I think because I spent 5 years in marketing and PR before I went back to graduate school to become a psychologist. And I think, one of the things was about, I loved what I was doing, but also I didn't want to be doing it when I was older. So I had my midlife crisis early. But I wanted a career that was going to give me time for my writing. And I didn't want to be doing teaching or a career that... Some writers have a certain number of words in them every day, and I could spend those words however I wanted to spend them. I could do PR with those words, or I could do other kinds of writing. So I switched careers, and I became a psychologist, which has been incredibly fertile ground for my writing and my creativity, although it's healthcare, so it's got a lot of aggravation and horrible things about it. Also, just as a profession, difficult things about it. Overall, I love what I do. And so when we talk about loving, would you recommend the writing life? My question to you guys back was are they talking about I don't have an MFA. I didn't go to grad school for an MFA. I often go to residencies and I'm the only one there without an MFA. I have a doctorate, obviously, but I don't want to spend more money on school. And I figured out other ways to make writing community. So it's sort of would I recommend the writing life? It's life. So I think anybody can do it. Would I recommend publishing and trying to do that? Yeah, if you don't expect to be rich and you don't
Sure.
nobody's getting rich off this life.
Right.
Let me say that. Maybe Stephen King, but so I think when we talk about this, it's maybe talking about it in a different way about what do you need to nurture your life so that you can have a fulfilling writing life. Maybe for some people that is an MFA, maybe for some people that's teaching, maybe for some people it's doing what you guys are doing. maybe it's a whole different career. I've met plenty of writers like myself who are social workers or in mental health or working, in different fields and writing, also. Like I've had 2 full-time careers for my whole life. And I'm glad about that in some ways because I guess in a way, like my ego isn't tied up into my success in either one. Like I have satisfactions in both. And that's the life that I think I would recommend, although maybe not the hours.
That is a very good point. And I actually had never thought about the question that way because JT and I have both been kind of background writers throughout our, I guess you call it our professional careers. And now that we're retired, we're focusing specifically on the writing life. But I never really thought about it, neither of us has an MFA either, and we've kind of tossed the idea back and forth. But we've just basically started writing based on our life experiences and the fact that we like to put words on paper and make up stories and hopefully make people happy.
Yeah. Well, and I think, there are lots of ways of making writing community. Like what I've found is I started doing writing residencies about 25 years ago when, and applying and going to do them. And I've met a tremendous community of people, other artists of all kinds. And that's sort of been, I call it my little MFA thing, because one of the things you get from an MFA is that community and that connection with a lot of other writers. And sometimes that's hard to make depending on where you live. I mean, easier now maybe with the internet than it used to be. I will say that one of the nice things about working with Trio House Press and winning this award is that one of the poets, part of the reason I submitted to this contest is I knew David Groff from one of my residencies and we had stayed in touch for about 10 years. He's a wonderful poet and he published with Trio House and his books were beautiful and I was like, I should submit to this contest too. It was the first time they ran the contest. And then it was really cool because David ended up being my editor for Trio House on the book. The book was in very good shape, but we did work a little bit together to change a little bit of the beginning part, which I was struggling with a little bit. Not substantially, but in a way that's really good. The prologue in the book is actually the last thing I wrote. But it was really nice because having that community, I knew David and trusted him, and he's an excellent editor. I had an editor that I was working with all along. She sort of functions for years now, and I've worked with her. But you have to make your own community.
Yes, and as you said, this is kind of what JT and I are doing is we've met some in-person independent authors, but we're also meeting a lot of interesting people by doing these podcasts remotely too.
Yeah.
So the community, I think we are re-energized every time we talk to someone like you because we learn new things about ourselves and about other writers.
Yeah, it's so important. It's just such a nice thing. And I think there's so many ways to do it now online and with classes and that kind of thing too.
Yeah, it is a lot of fun. So speaking of fun, we come to our final question, which we always find to be kind of surprising based on what we've learned about our new author friends. So what is something unexpected in your past that we won't see in your bio?
Well, I started out as a visual art major in college, and I still do. I took classes at Moore College of Art when I was in high school. Visual art, and I really liked a lot of fabric art. I'm actually a very good needle pointer. I love needle pointing. I'm working on a baby present for my one niece right now. And, I think writers having other hobbies and other things that are is really an interesting thing. I think there's a piece of this about learning something new. I always want to be in a situation where I'm kind of trying something new or learning something new. So visual art is really important to me. I think left to my own devices, I probably would have been an art history major. I still fantasize when I have spare time about going to the art museum and doing their docent program and being an art docent there. We have a lot of good museums in Philadelphia, so I think about that a lot if I ever retire, which it doesn't look like I'm ever going to do these days. I will say the other thing that popped up when you asked that question is I used to write examples for college English textbooks right after I graduated from college. You don't see that on my resume, but I was the one writing the sample paragraphs, the funny sample paragraphs that you would read in some college English textbooks. So I did that for a little while too.
Well, that is fascinating. I never thought about. I guess somebody does have to write those, though.
Yeah, the guy who wrote the book, he would hire people to write the paragraphs, and he liked my writing, and I would write little funny paragraphs about things that happened, and as an example of whatever English grammar thing he was, doing for the book. It was fun. I did it for about a year for him. He was a good guy.
Well, that's awesome.
Okay, so Deb, here's your last chance. tell us where we can find your book, tell us where we can find you on the internet, and what is your preferred social media sites?
You can find me on all of the social media sites. I have an author page on Facebook. Deb Derrickson Kossmann is on Instagram and on Facebook as well. I'm on Blue Sky. I am not on Twitter. I'm on Threads, and I'm on LinkedIn. You can find me anywhere if you just search my name. But really, the best place to probably land is the website for the book and for me, which is lostfoundkept.com. A list of all the places you can buy the book. You can buy it directly from Trio House Press. It's a wonderful independent press, and they're growing and doing all kinds of wonderful things. I think they just announced their third Aurora Polaris Prize winner, and you can get it, all the usual places. And if you like it and you get it, please leave me a review on Amazon and Goodreads. I have an audiobook contract, so eventually there will be an audiobook. That's coming soon, hopefully, but it takes like 6 months or so, is my understanding, for that to happen. And so lots of good things.
Excellent.
I want to mention one other thing, though, actually. If anybody listening is interested, I'm happy to do book groups. I've been doing a lot of book groups and some memoir teaching as well. So reach out through the website, and happy to talk to you about, zooming in or attending a book group if it's local.
Okay. No, good, because I can only imagine the amount of the impact that you would have on a group, especially with folks thinking in the back of their mind, is she talking about my family?
There's been a lot of that.
So Cece and I thank Dr. Deb Kossmann for joining us on our amateur hour, and we've learned so much, and it's been a privilege. Thank you for being on our podcast, Deb. You can find this podcast. You can find this podcast and other podcasts like it. We do all sorts of interviews by going out to our website at www.carsonhume.com. Please reach out, and more importantly, please give us feedback. So what did we do right? What did we do wrong? Because feedback not only makes us better humans, it makes us better writers, and it makes us better podcasters. So please let us know. Thank you again, Deb.
Thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed it. Thanks for the great questions, too.
Okay. Everybody take care now. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.